When Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez finally stepped onto that hallowed Harvard stage to face Ben Shapiro in the winter of 2026, she did not merely walk into a debate. She walked into a meticulously engineered 8-year political trap that would systematically dismantle the illusion of her 2028 presidential campaign. As someone who has spent a lifetime navigating the brutal, unforgiving theater of national politics, who has orchestrated campaigns and witnessed the quiet destruction of political careers behind closed doors, I recognize the precise moment she crossed the threshold from phenomenon to casualty. To understand the magnitude of this televised execution, one must understand the history that led to it. For 8 long years, the conservative commentator Ben Shapiro had publicly offered her a sum of $10,000 simply to stand across from him and engage in a conversation about policy. Back in the political climate of August 2018, she swatted the offer away with the effortless grace of a rising superstar, taking to her massive social media platforms to brand the challenge as political catcalling. She publicly dismissed his offer as the unsolicited, harassing noise of a man harboring bad intentions, successfully and brilliantly framing a standard policy debate as a sinister act of misogyny. She ignored his subsequent requests with the haughty, untouchable confidence of a political star ascending rapidly through 2019, bypassed him entirely during the chaotic and transformative years of 2020 and 2021, and continued to operate as if he did not exist straight through the midterm elections and deep into 2025. But the political landscape of 2026 dictated a harsh, unavoidable new reality. Her inner circle was quietly, carefully assembling the vast, complex machinery required for a 2028 presidential campaign. And the cold, unyielding truth of national politics is that no candidate can credibly seek the highest office in the free world while conspicuously fleeing from a podcaster's debate challenge for nearly a decade. Refusing a debate for 8 years is a narrative of cowardice, not a brand a presidential candidate can successfully carry into the fires of a general election. So, inevitably, driven by the inescapable gravity of her own towering ambition and the desperate advice of her strategists, she finally said yes. The terms they agreed upon were deceptively simple on paper, but to any veteran legislator, they represented the terrifying, complete removal of all structural, institutional armor. It was agreed there would be a 1-hour debate, overseen by a neutral, veteran journalist chosen only after 3 grueling weeks of intense, combative negotiation between the two camps. There would be a live audience of 750 people filling the tiered seating of the forum. Those seats sold out in a staggering 4 minutes, with tickets immediately scalped on the secondary market for $2,000 apiece. Crucially, the format mandated no prepared statements, no protective attorneys hovering over her shoulder to object, no obsequious committee staff passing her lifeline notes, and absolutely no luxury of those comfortable 12-second silences that politicians so frequently use in hearing rooms to run out the clock and project a false sense of dignity. The stage at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University, a historic forum that had hosted debates between vehemently disagreeing figures since before either of these two combatants was even born, featured no elevated dais, no heavy wooden witness table, no gavel, no committee members positioned above a witness, and no institutional architecture designed to make one person inherently powerful and the other merely answerable. There were just 2 identical black podiums positioned exactly 10 feet apart, completely exposed to the glaring lights and the unforgiving lenses of the camera. 30 million Americans were tuned in live, with every major television network carrying the feed, and the internet broadcasting it even faster, before the moderator had even finished her perfunctory introduction. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez stood at the left podium, adorned in a sharp dark blazer and a crisp white shirt, radiating the carefully calculated aesthetic of a woman actively auditioning for the presidency of the United States. Yet, to a trained political eye, her physical posture was remarkably, fundamentally different from her time in congressional hearings. She was standing, utterly exposed. Her hands were hanging free rather than planted safely flat on a heavy mahogany desk. There was no convoluted committee procedure to hide inside, no partisan colleagues to yield her their time when she stumbled. Just her, a microphone, and the man standing at the other podium who had been preparing for this exact conversation for 8 grueling years. On the right podium stood Ben Shapiro, wearing a dark suit. He brought absolutely nothing to the podium. There were no notes, no folders, no heavy binders containing talking points. There was only a single glass of water resting on the surface, a glass he would not touch. He exuded the terrifying, particular stillness of a man who requires no written notes because his entire strategy is meticulously organized in his head, categorized by topic, cross-referenced by date, and ready to be weaponized at a blistering, overwhelming pace that opponents simply cannot match. She had, over the years, successfully survived the quiet, intellectual data traps laid by Senator J.D. Vance, the folksy, disarming verbal snares of Senator John Kennedy, the pedagogical, grading-style questioning of Speaker Mike Johnson, and the looming, unpredictable silence of Donald Trump. However, 8 years of congressional hearings had exclusively trained her to deflect, to pivot, and to filibuster. She had never faced a format where silence was explicitly forbidden and direct. Factual answers were demanded at a relentless speed of 200 words per minute. Given the floor for a standard 2-minute opening statement, she immediately launched a calculated, theatrical strike fully optimized for viral circulation on social media. She looked directly into the camera and claimed she accepted this debate solely to expose what conservative media looked like in person. She mocked him, stating he had made an entire career out of talking fast, yelling at unprepared college students, and aggressively clipping the answers of individuals who did not possess her level of media training. With a dramatic, clearly focus-grouped pause, a pause engineered perfectly for a TikTok edit, she declared that she was not one of his college freshmen, and this stage was not his podcast. The audience, specifically the progressive section, which occupied approximately half the room, erupted into thunderous applause. It was the visceral sound of an audience fully expecting their congressional champion to effortlessly, totally dismantle a conservative pundit. But Shapiro did not wait for the applause to fade, nor did he wait for the moderator to guide the transition. He spoke directly into the roar of the crowd, his timing as deliberate and precise as a surgeon's scalpel. He immediately trapped her with the inescapable weight of her own history, reminding the room that in August 2018, she had equated his simple offer of a policy debate to sexual harassment. He forced her into a brutal, inescapable, logical corner, stating that either his 2018 offer was not catcalling after all, in which case she owed every single woman who had actually experienced the trauma of sexual harassment a profound public apology for trivializing their pain, or she had just willingly showed up on stage to respond to a catcaller. He locked eyes with her and demanded to know which it was. The question landed like a physical blow before the progressive cheers had even finished echoing, instantly suffocating the room in a heavy, tense, absolute quiet. It was not quiet because the question was a cheap shot. It was quiet because the question demanded a logical answer, and both available options were politically radioactive. As a seasoned observer of political body language, I watched her hands with intense fascination. In the safety of a congressional hearing, her hands were dynamic instruments of authority, constantly pointing, gesturing, and conducting the room as she made sweeping moral claims. Now, faced with an unanswerable dilemma, her right hand rose in a reflexive, habitual attempt to seize the moral high ground. It hovered in midair for a desperate, agonizing second as her brain fought a violent war against contradictory neurological instructions. The stillness training of the hearing room was fighting the gesture training of the debate stage. The hand hung at chest height for approximately 1 second, the exact duration of a human body receiving conflicting commands, and then fell heavily to grip the edge of the black podium. She gripped it hard. In 4 months of intense hearings leading up to this moment, she had never gripped anything. Her hands had gone flat, they had contracted, they had checked for a ring, but they had never gripped. Because gripping is the universal political tell of visible desperation. To grip a podium a mere 30 seconds into a debate, before a single substantive policy question is even asked, is not normal. It is an early sign of structural collapse. It is the body's involuntary way of screaming to the world, that it desperately needs an anchor in a raging storm, and it needs it immediately. Shapiro did not let the catcalling trap breathe for more than 3 seconds, because the debate format, unlike a hearing room, does not permit 12-second silences. He immediately pivoted to policy, aggressively attacking her signature legislative achievement, the Green New Deal. He unleashed a devastating barrage of undeniable mathematics, noting that the estimated cost of her proposal was between $51 and $93 trillion over a 10-year period. He cited specific models, the American Action Forum, the Tax Foundation, and the Congressional Budget Office, establishing undeniable credibility. Generously using the lowest possible estimate of $51 trillion, he calmly pointed out that the entire total annual revenue of the United States federal government is roughly $4.4 trillion. He wielded the calculator like a blunt instrument, mathematically demonstrating that her proposal cost approximately 11.6 times the entire annual revenue of the country. He reminded her that when pressed on 60 Minutes about funding, she had dismissed critics as sounding like Dr. Evil. Looking directly at her, he stated he was not Dr. Evil. He was simply a person with a calculator, and the calculator clearly showed a massive, gaping hole of approximately $7 trillion per year, for which she had completely failed to identify a funding source. He demanded to know where the $7 trillion was. The format required an immediate response, and she attempted the standard Washington deflection. She instantly tried to shift the conversation away from math and toward morality, arguing that the cost of her proposal had to be weighed against the catastrophic cost of global climate inaction, citing a $23 trillion global economic cost by a future date. Shapiro cut her off instantly. The interruption was not rude, but it was incredibly fast and completely clean. His voice merged into her sentence flawlessly, arriving at the end of her thought before the sentence had even finished establishing its direction, much like a speeding car forcefully merging into a lane before the current occupant has cleared it. He told her flatly that he was not asking about the abstract cost of inaction. He was explicitly asking about the mathematical cost of her specific action. He reiterated the devastating numbers. 51 trillion total, 7 trillion short per year, demanding a specific funding mechanism. Her hands continuously gripped, loosened, and re-gripped the podium, betraying a complete loss of physical control as she sought a dominance the stage was violently denying her. Flustered and reverting to the populist red meat that always worked on social media, she threw out the radical proposition of taxing every single billionaire in America at 100%, clarifying it as complete confiscation of wealth, not just a high marginal tax rate. She named Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, Warren Buffett, and Bill Gates. Shapiro, anticipating this exact pivot, already had the devastating math waiting for her. He answered his own question before she could finish formulating it. He informed her, and the 30 million people watching, that liquidating the total combined assets of every billionaire in the nation would yield a one-time sum of exactly $4.7 trillion. He emphasized the phrase one time, noting that once you confiscate everything, they have nothing left to take the following year. He explained to her, as one explains to a child failing arithmetic, that she had raised $4.7 trillion, but she needed $7 trillion every single year. Confiscating every billionaire's entire wealth, he noted, pays for approximately 8 months of her Green New Deal proposal. After 8 months, the money is completely gone, the billionaires are entirely broke, and her proposal is still $6.3 trillion short for the remainder of the year. Once again, refusing to let her breathe, he relentlessly demanded a realistic funding mechanism. She attempted a second retreat, this time into the ephemeral safety of societal values, stating the question was not about specific funding mechanisms, but about whether we as a society care enough to act. Shapiro hammered back with absolute logical brutality, declaring that it is absolutely about specific funding mechanisms. He stated that you do not get to propose the largest single expenditure in human history and then dismiss the math as being merely about values. Values, he reminded her coldly, do not pay bills. Mechanisms pay bills. He demanded a mechanism. From my vantage point, watching this unfold, I could see her internal processing speed visibly, tragically deteriorating. Her first answer had been immediate, a reflexive defense. Her second answer had a half-second delay. Her third answer, the desperate pivot to values, suffered a full-second delay. Each tiny delay was the visible manifestation of a human brain desperately trying to process incoming attacks while recognizing that the available avenues of escape were rapidly narrowing. In a congressional hearing room, processing time is largely invisible. The witness sits comfortably, the room waits respectfully, and the cameras passively absorb the silence. But on a debate stage, under glaring lights, processing time is intensely, uncomfortably visible. The audience sees the delay, hears the desperate filler words, and feels the agonizing, stretching gap between the question asked and the answer that simply refuses to arrive. Shapiro pressed his advantage, reminding her that she had been in Congress for 8 full years. In those 8 years, he noted she had not produced a single funding mechanism for her signature proposal. There was no white paper, no request for a CBO score, no detailed economic plan. She had proposed $51 trillion of spending, offered a pop culture movie reference as a defense, and tonight, 8 years later, she still did not have an answer. The progressive section of the audience, which had been so vocal minutes earlier, was now completely, terrifyingly silent. It was not a hostile silence. It was the silence of individuals processing brutal mathematics. The kind of processing that occurs when someone does the undeniable math right in front of you, and the numbers absolutely do not lie, no matter how much you wish they did. Sensing the blood in the water, Shapiro seamlessly transitioned into a new tactical phase, subjecting her to a rapid-fire, brutal sequence of yes or no questions. This is a classic, devastating tactic that explicitly strips away the nuanced language politicians use to hide their true positions, reminding her that a sitting president must make binary, yes or no decisions every single day regarding the nuclear codes, military deployments, and economic sanctions. He demanded to know plainly and directly if she still supported defunding the police. Her chin lifted into a defensive posture, the debate chin of a woman who has been told she cannot answer and is desperately trying to prove she can, but the answer did not arrive immediately. The political reality was complicated. In 2020, she had loudly supported defunding the police. By 2021, violent crime in her specific district had surged by an alarming 22%. By 2022, she had quietly, stealthily removed the word defund from her campaign website. And by 2023, she had completely reframed the policy as reimagining public safety. The word defund was now the single word she most wanted to avoid saying, yet it was the word she most needed to address to maintain her radical base. She squirmed, trying to sanitize her record with focus group phrases, stating she supported reallocating resources to community-based programs. Shapiro would not let her escape the trap. He demanded a yes or no. He defined defunding as reducing police budgets and demanded to know if she supported it. She protested that it was not a yes or no question. He countered that it absolutely was a binary choice. You either support reducing police budgets or you do not. The audience produced a strange hybrid sound, a mixture of uncomfortable shifting and quiet groans, the sound of a room watching a definitive, binary question meet a slippery, non-binary answer, and collectively understanding that the non-binary evasion was, in itself, a definitive answer of political cowardice. Her grip on the podium tightened significantly. Both hands were now engaged in the double grip, holding the edges of the podium the way a desperate passenger holds a railing on a ship violently tossing in rough water. This physical manifestation of panic was visible to the first 10 rows of the audience and to every high-definition camera in the room. He moved to the next question without pausing, using speed as a weapon just as effectively as the content of the questions. He asked if private health insurance should be completely abolished under her Medicare for All proposal. She attempted to soften the blow by stating the goal was a transition. He cut through the rhetoric again, demanding a yes or no regarding whether private insurance companies would continue to exist. He pointed out the grim political reality that 180 million Americans currently possess employer-sponsored insurance and demanded to know if they would keep it. She stumbled, claiming they would receive something better. He seized the stumble, translating it for the audience, they would lose it. That was the hidden truth. Under her proposal, private insurance is entirely eliminated, meaning 180 million Americans lose their current coverage. He noted she could argue they get something better, which is a valid separate debate, but the factual answer to whether they keep their current plan is no, and she simply lacked the political courage to say the word no aloud. He moved relentlessly to immigration, dragging out her inflammatory tweet from the 28th of June 2018, demanding the abolition of the Immigration Enforcement Agency, ICE. He asked if her stance had evolved. There was a full 2-second silence. On a debate stage, 2 seconds is an absolute eternity. The audience registered the pause immediately and instinctively, the exact way a crowd registers a missed note in a musical performance, understanding that something vital that was supposed to be there was entirely missing. She finally answered that her position had evolved to reflect reforms. He ruthlessly mocked the evolution, pointing out how it had changed from a radical demand to abolish an agency to a complicated stance over 4 years, comparing it to her contradictory evolution on funding the Iron Dome, where she went from stripping funding to voting present to stripping funding again. He quoted Senator Kennedy, noting she was acting like a political weather vane, spinning whichever way the populist wind blew. The relentless speed of his delivery was steadily eroding her smooth, carefully constructed public facade. Wearing away her political armor wave by crushing wave, her physical posture fundamentally, noticeably broke. She shifted her weight entirely from the balls of her feet to her heels, leaning backward to absorb the overwhelming impact. The backward shift was small, perhaps half an inch, but it fundamentally changed her body's center of gravity from a forward, attacking posture to a backward, receiving, and surviving posture. By this point, the cumulative physical retreat meant she was a full inch farther away from the microphone than she was when the debate began, forcing her to physically strain her voice just to be heard at the same volume. Then came the clinical, devastating autopsy of her congressional career. Shapiro asked a simple, lethal question: how many bills have you sponsored that were actually signed into enforceable federal law? The question arrived without preamble, without folksy stories or memories of a hometown. Just the stark question delivered like a factual verdict. She knew the terrible number. She had been asked this number in prior hearings, but in those settings, she could sit in dignified silence and let the clock run out. Standing before 750 paying attendees and 30 million viewers, facing an opponent whose next question was already loaded in the chamber, silence was a forfeit. She tried to claim that legislation is not the only measure of political impact, asserting she had moved the ideological Overton window on climate, healthcare, and economic justice. It is the classic, desperate excuse for politicians who lack legislative competence. Shapiro ruthlessly exposed the truth, stating that moving a concept does not feed starving people. Only legislation feeds people. He reminded her she was a legislator, a title derived directly from the act of passing legislation. He pressed again, asking how many were signed into law. She deflected, saying she had introduced dozens. He corrected her instantly. Introduced, not passed. He demanded the number of bills she sponsored that are currently enforceable federal law. She blamed the political environment. He gave the audience the answer. She refused to say 0. In 8 years, despite proposing over $125 trillion in radical new spending across her major platforms, she had successfully delivered exactly 0 legislation. He turned away from her and looked directly at the live audience, speaking to the 750 people who had paid thousands of dollars to be in the room. He pointed out the staggering irony that she was the most followed member of Congress, possessing 13 million followers on X and 8 million on Instagram, making her the most clipped, quoted, and screenshotted legislator in American history. And yet, after 8 years of viral clips, glamorous Instagram stories, fighting oligarchy tours, appearances at the Munich Security Conference, and wearing custom dresses with political slogans to the Met Gala, her actual legislative output was completely non-existent. He looked back at her and clinically diagnosed her as the most famous do-nothing in American political history. He clarified that he meant it not as a cheap insult, but as a precise diagnosis. because the incredible fame and the total lack of legislative achievement were deeply connected. He argued she was famous precisely because she did not do the hard work of legislating. She was famous because she generated endless digital content. He drew a devastating, unarguable distinction between generating viral content for social media and doing the hard, grinding work of governance. Content, he noted, is a short clip that travels the internet rapidly before the inevitable factual correction arrives. Legislation is a permanent law that exists and affects lives long after the viral clip is entirely forgotten. He accused her of choosing content over governance, effectively scamming 571,000 small-dollar donors who give $16.81 a month, falsely believing they are funding actual, tangible legislative progress, rather than funding her personal brand. The line "most famous do nothing" landed in the live audience with the force of an artillery shell. It was not the quiet, respectful absorption of a congressional hearing room. It was a visceral, chaotic eruption. Gasps echoed loudly from the progressive section of the crowd, completely stunned by the brutality of the truth. Raucous laughter erupted from the conservative section. And in the vital middle, the undecided section, there was a particular, thoughtful silence, the silence of independent voters processing a perfectly articulated phrase that they immediately knew they would repeat at the dinner table the next night. Her body received the eruption of the crowd, the way a delicate structure receives a shockwave. There was an involuntary, visible lean backward, another half-inch retreat as her body absorbed the impact through her shifting center of gravity. Her heels pressed even harder into the stage floor. Approaching the final climax of the hour, Shapiro deliberately, noticeably slowed his breakneck pace. He dropped his speed by approximately 20%, moving from a machine gun 200 words per minute down to a deliberate, measured 160. This sudden deceleration was a terrifying signal to any seasoned political operative familiar with his style. It meant the rapid-fire, overwhelming assault was over, and the true, underlying thesis of the night, the fatal blow, was about to be delivered. He stepped back from the policies for a moment, acknowledging he had grilled her on the Green New Deal, Medicare for All, defunding the police, and her completely barren legislative record. But, he stated, the real question he had been waiting 8 years to ask was not about any of those specific policies. He looked at her not with the hostility of a partisan opponent, nor with the contempt of a rival, but with the genuine, terrifying, intellectual curiosity of a highly logical mind confronting a massive 8-year contradiction that it simply could not resolve without a direct answer. He synthesized her entire political existence into a single narrative of shifting stances, unfunded trillions, quiet website edits to hide unpopular positions, sudden shifts from abolishing ICE to reforming it, and contradictory, cowardly present votes on vital foreign policy matters, like the Iron Dome. He noted a definitive pattern. The pattern, he argued, was not one of deep, abiding conviction, because true conviction possesses a constant direction, it stays firm under pressure, and it usually costs the politicians something. Her pattern, conversely, was purely about positioning. He accused her of saying whatever the specific audience standing in front of her at that moment required to hear. Pushing the Green New Deal when climate anxiety was trending, yelling to defund the police when the BLM movement was trending, and pivoting to the moderate center when a presidential primary was rapidly approaching. Her positions changed, he noted, not because the factual evidence changed, but simply because the target audience changed. He offered a genuine, chilling compliment, calling her the most talented political communicator in Congress, stating he had studied her for 8 years and believed she was better on camera than anyone he had ever seen, even comparing her raw charisma favorably against historical communication giants like Ronald Reagan and Barack Obama. He praised her unique ability to hold a room, to look directly into a camera lens and make millions of isolated people feel as though she were speaking intimately to them. But he warned that such immense gifts can be used for two fundamentally different purposes. They can be used to communicate the difficult truth, or they can be used to expertly perform the truth. He stressed that performance and truth are completely different entities. Performance yields a viral clip and 13 million followers. Truth yields hard-fought laws, but she had 0 bills signed. And then he delivered the kill shot. He asked the question he had been asking since 2018, the question she had cowardly labeled catcalling to successfully avoid. He asked it simply and directly, "Do you actually believe any of this?" He challenged her to prove she genuinely believed in the Green New Deal mathematically, with a real funding mechanism and a coherent plan. He challenged her to prove she believed in abolishing ICE operationally, with a functional alternative system designed and ready to implement. He challenged her to prove she believed in Medicare for all practically, with a realistic transition framework for the 180 million people who would lose their insurance. Or, he asked, was it all just content? Was it merely the brand she manufactured for the audience? Was it just the viral clip that travels before the correction? He demanded that if she truly believed it, she must defend it right there, right then, on that stage. Give him the math. Give him the funding mechanism. Give him the transition plan. Give him just one specific, factual answer to one specific question. He noted that in 8 years, he had not received a single one, and tonight, he was asking one final time. He concluded that if she did not believe it, if it was all just content, a brand designed to generate the $16.81 donations, then she owed it to America to confess, because the voters deserve to know whether the most famous progressive leader in the country actually believed in achieving progress or simply believed in accumulating followers. What followed was the most deafening, catastrophic, agonizing silence I have ever witnessed in modern political history. In a strict debate format, absolute silence should not even be possible. The format demands a response. It demands friction. The veteran moderator, the live audience, the unforgiving high-definition cameras, the 30 million people watching at home, every single entity in that room fully expected the person standing at the podium to speak, because speaking is the sole purpose of standing at a debate podium. But Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez did not speak, not for 1 second, not for 2, but for 8 agonizing, eternal seconds. 8 full seconds in a television format that naturally only allows 2 before panic sets in. She stood perfectly frozen at the podium in complete silence. This was not the composed, dignified silence of a congressional hearing room. It was not the 12-second silence that hearing audiences had been trained to interpret as deep, thoughtful dignity. This was a naked, highly visible, terrified silence. The live audience could plainly see a woman standing at a podium with a live microphone, utterly incapable of using it. They could see the yawning, horrific gap between a devastating question and an answer that was completely failing to arrive. And that gap, in a room packed with 750 people under glaring lights and broadcasting to the world, was the loudest, most destructive silence imaginable. It was a standing silence. A politician sitting in silence at a witness table appears to be a person thinking deeply. A politician standing in silence at a debate podium is undeniably a person who has been asked a fundamental question about their core beliefs in front of 30 million voters and simply does not possess an answer. Her eyes did not seek out a camera. They did not look for an exit sign. They did not stare into the middle distance. Her eyes locked directly onto the neutral moderator, the one person whose job it was to move the conversation forward when it had completely stalled. Her eyes silently screamed for help, not with dramatic flailing, but with the specific, terrifying look of a person who is actively drowning in water that is only chest high, overwhelmed by a current vastly stronger than her ability to swim. But the moderator did not intervene. The veteran journalist understood perfectly that in this context, the silence was the answer, and moderators who understand that silence is an answer do not interrupt it to rescue the drowning candidate. Shapiro waited the full 8 seconds. He had waited 8 years. 8 more seconds was entirely inconsequential. Recognizing she was broken, he simply said, "That's what I thought." He stepped back from his podium, not with dramatic flair, but with the calm, satisfied step of a man who has finally asked his ultimate question, received his definitive answer, and knows he does not ever need to ask another. He told her he did not believe she was a bad person. Rather, she was a highly talented person who had tragically confused political performance with actual governance, and that this confusion had cost her voters 8 years of empty content in exchange for 0 years of tangible legislation. He thanked her for the debate, noting it was worth the 8-year wait. Then, in the ultimate display of dominance, he picked up the glass of water he had not touched for the entire grueling hour, took a single, calm sip, and set it down. The sip was the final punctuation mark. The sip telegraphed to the world, "I am completely finished, I am not the least bit stressed, and the water you watch me not need for an hour is still here." Her eventual response was a desperate 3-minute and 44-second energetic performance completely devoid of any mathematical substance. The debate format allowed her to use the physical energy and vocabulary that hearing rooms had suppressed. So she moved, she gestured, she pointed, she attacked his lack of public service, called him merely a professional debater rather than a legislator, claimed that the ability to talk fast is not the ability to govern, and cited her abstract impact on the Overton window once again. It was an effective, theatrical performance designed perfectly to generate supportive, defensive clips for the progressive media ecosystem to rally around the next morning. However, it contained absolutely zero specific, factual responses to zero specific questions. She did not address the $7 trillion gap, the billionaire confiscation math, the yes or no on defunding the police, the complete lack of passed bills, or the core question of whether she truly believed her own proposals. Shapiro did not even bother to respond to her frantic rebuttal. He stood with his hands comfortably at his sides, his face carrying the calm expression of a man who had finally had the conversation he spent 8 years demanding and had received exactly the devastating answer he always expected. Everything in the world except an actual answer. The political fallout was instantaneous and absolute. Within 24 hours, the internet was completely saturated with the undeniable political carnage. The first viral clip to break was the most famous Do Nothing segment, including the visceral, chaotic eruption from the live audience. The clip was a mere 9 seconds long, yet it was shared an astonishing 44 million times in the first day, becoming the most shared clip across all media platforms. The phrase permanently entered the American political lexicon, sticking because it perfectly articulated a reality that millions had been thinking, but no one had possessed the platform to successfully declare. The second clip was the brutal dismantling of the Green New Deal math, ending with his devastating line about offering a movie reference to pay for $51 trillion. This clip circulated wildly through economic communities, policy analysis accounts, and an entire ecosystem of pragmatic voters who had been desperately waiting for 7 years for someone, anyone, to simply do the basic math directly to her face. Shapiro did it at 200 words per minute, and the sheer speed made the math feel like a final, inescapable judicial verdict. The third clip was the rapid-fire yes or no sequence regarding defunding the police and Medicare for all, ending with his challenge on whether she could answer a binary question. This clip immediately became the permanent, unyielding diagnostic template for every single future interview she would ever endure. Every reporter, every moderator, and every future debate opponent now possessed the exact framework to destroy her. Ask a binary question, watch her pivot, note the pivot to the audience, and expose her consistent inability to answer directly. But it was the fourth clip, the full 8 seconds of standing, visible silence following the question. Do you actually believe any of this? That served as the true, undeniable executioner of her 2028 presidential ambitions. The 2028 presidential conversation surrounding her ended that night, not because she formally withdrew, but because the debate definitively, publicly revealed what political insiders had always known. Her revolutionary proposals existed solely as digital content, completely failing to exist as executable reality. A presidential candidate whose signature policy platforms cannot survive a 1-hour interrogation from a podcaster armed with nothing but a microphone and a basic calculator absolutely cannot survive a brutal primary debate stage standing next to a seasoned executive governor who has actually managed a state budget. As one high-level Democratic strategist bleakly and anonymously noted to Politico the next morning, using a phrase that traveled faster than any video clip, "If Shapiro can do this, What happens when she debates Whitmer? That phrase became her political epitaph. It wasn't because Shapiro was more inherently dangerous than Governor Whitmer. It was because Shapiro possessed no institutional authority, no subpoena power, and no committee staff. He was merely a commentator. If a commentator could completely dismantle her entire political platform in under an hour, an executive governor with a proven mathematical record of governance would eviscerate her in 10 minutes flat. The devastating reality of this televised execution resonated far beyond the wealthy enclaves of Harvard. In Middletown, Ohio, deep in the working-class heartland, voters like Crystal Atkins sat in the break room of the Brighter Days Recovery Center, watching the replay of those 8 agonizing seconds of silence on the television. Crystal recognized the profound difference between this debate and all the congressional hearings that came before it. In the hearings, opponents like Vance, Kennedy, Johnson, and Trump possessed the full, terrifying weight of the government behind them. They sat elevated on a dais, armed with committees, subpoenas, and rules. Shapiro had none of that. He had a calculator and a microphone, and he inflicted more permanent damage in 1 hour than the entire machinery of Congress had managed in years. Crystal correctly identified exactly why it happened. In a hearing room, AOC could use silence as a protective shield, projecting an illusion of dignity. But standing up in front of 750 people, stripped of her attorneys, her notes, and the ability to yield her time, that same silence looked like exactly what it was, the terrifying reality of a politician who does not have an answer to the most fundamental question of her career. The politicians in Congress always attacked her on what she did, or the words she used, or the money she spent. Shapiro bypassed all of that and attacked her on what she fundamentally believed. And she could not answer because genuine belief in a policy requires a realistic plan, and a realistic plan requires workable math. And the math of her entire political brand simply did not work. She had known the math didn't work for 8 years, yet she proposed the policies anyway because the proposals were never designed to be implemented. They were flawlessly designed to trend on social media, to farm engagement, and to build a lucrative brand. Shapiro finally asked the question, and her 8 seconds of standing, visible, undeniable silence screamed to the entire nation. Yes, she knows it's not real. That night in Cambridge permanently altered the trajectory of the Democratic Party. The woman who had indignantly and successfully called a standard debate offer an act of catcalling in 2018 was finally brutally unmasked in 2026 by the relentless application of elementary mathematics. We finally discovered why she had spent 8 years ensuring this debate never happened. She knew in 2018 exactly what the rest of the country horrifyingly discovered in 2026. Her policies, her brand, and her entire political existence could not survive 60 minutes of rigorous questioning from a man with a calculator. The era of pure political content had violently collided with the unyielding wall of political reality, and reality won. God bless the voters who finally demanded the math, and God bless the terrible, illuminating power of an 8-second silence.